Here is Pulitzer Prize-winning Washington Post reporter David Fahrenthold discussing the location where Donald Trump wants to have the G7 next year.
It is basically the keystone of Donald Trump's entire hospitality golf hotel business. It produces more revenue for him every year than any hotel or golf course, and he has one of its biggest loans on it. If you were to pick one property that Donald Trump's financial health depended on, this would be it. June is the second slowest month for Doral. Only August is worse. Their occupancy rate is under 40%. So even if Trump just charged the cost, which we have no idea if he's going to, but even if he didn't try to make a profit off each individual room, he's filling the resort at a time it would be mostly empty.
Joining our discussion now is Bill Kristol, editor-at-large of The Bulwark and the director of Defending Democracy Together. He served in senior positions in the Reagan and Bush administrations. And Rick Wilson is with us. He's a former Republican strategist and contributor to the Daily Beast. He's the author of Everything Trump Touches Dies. Bill Kristol, your reaction to the announcement today that the president plans to commit these two violations of the Emoluments Clause, both the domestic and foreign.
Yeah, and God knows what other laws are being violated. I mean, there are laws for federal contracting. Obviously, you can't just give contracts to yourself or to your best friend. I mean, it's taxpayer money that's involved. And Congress really needs to, I think this is a very good instance where Congress needs to demand the documents, who made the decision. Well, we know Trump made the decision, but what documents were provided, what competitive bids were gotten from the private entity, from different hotel chains. Where's the Secret Service report saying that Doral would be easier to handle than some other place? I mean, the idea that Trump treats the government as his own little private business. He can just choose to put things one place rather than another. And that's the law. Doral is not important, obviously. The amount of money isn't huge. It's not like Syria. It's not like Ukraine. But the sort of just the routinization of corruption, turning us into a kind of third world country where the president treats the federal government as his own plaything to use as he chooses, is very dangerous. And I think that Congress has every right to demand these documents. Think of it for a minute. Lawrence, you've been in Washington a lot. I mean, you worked on the Hill. That's announced from the White House? There's some part of the State Department or Treasury that's in charge of going around and taking bids and figuring out what the most logistically convenient place is for foreign leaders. And they make a decision or a recommendation. And occasionally it might go up the chain and someone would say, well, maybe it'd be more appropriate to have it here rather than there. But the president just decides to spend federal money wherever he wants. And in this case, at his own resort. It's lawless.
And Rick Wilson, when Mick Mulvaney announced it today, he threw in, while he was at it, don't even think about getting any documents that would show how this decision was made.
Yeah, right. I mean, that was like the icing on the cake of Mick Mulvaney's super horrible bad day yes. that he threw out there, basically casually saying, oh, by the way, the president is just not going to let you know how he personally decided to benefit himself with a several $1 million contract for his South Florida House of Bedbugs hotel.
And Bill, the urgency, you sense more urgency about impeachment now when you throw in the future factor. And you use this example as one, but there's also when you see what happened in Syria, which was not something you could have predicted 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, that the president will do something like this. There are other places on the map where he could do similar things.
Yeah, just to say two things. I mean, 2 years ago, when I would make the argument that this man shouldn't be president and was unfit for office, people would say, look, he says a lot of stupid things. He may even want to try to do a lot of stupid and even illegal things. But McGahn stops him from firing Mueller, and Mattis stops him from doing this. McMaster stops him from doing that. And there was some truth to that. He was a little ineffectual in his lawlessness. Now he's doing it, and we're seeing the consequences in the real world in Syria in a truly disastrous and depressing way. And with Ukraine, are we confident that he is now going to ensure that we have a free and fair election here in 2020 without foreign interference, with a strong government reaction to disinformation, with a strong effort to make sure election security is maintained and strengthened? I mean, after watching him invite or pressure a foreign government to get involved in our elections, I mean, are we confident that we have a president who's going to stand up for the integrity of our election? So I do feel a sense of urgency here. It's not just about holding Trump accountable for what he has done. It's about what could happen in the world and at home over the next year.
And Rick Wilson, I think we know that Mick Mulvaney doesn't just decide to walk out to that microphone today on his own. No. And the mastermind of the impeachment defense, Donald Trump, sent him out there. And by now, even though Mick Mulvaney Trump might have thought what Mulvaney was doing was fine when he was watching it, by now Donald Trump has seen enough reaction to know how badly that went.
I don't think even Sean Hannity holding Donald close and rocking him to sleep tonight is going to make him feel any better about the fact that Mick Mulvaney went out there and essentially set himself on fire on national television. He brought down, thinking he was going to deflate the bubble of this idea of quid pro quo. Was not a good idea on Trump's part, because Mulvaney went out there and on live television said, oh, all those denials we've been making for 2 weeks now, they're all inoperative because I came out and I said there was a quid pro quo. We deliberately withheld the money. And Mick Mulvaney, by the way, from his other hat as OMB director, his one hat is OMB director, his other hat is acting temporary provisional deputy, whatever, chief of staff. As OMB director, he's the guy who says those checks don't move, those numbers don't happen. So he put himself in a terrible spot and the president in a terrible spot. And that's why the president's lawyers are so furious tonight.
Rick Wilson and Bill Kristol, thank you both for joining us. Really appreciate it. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.